The helmet camera footage was recovered 3 days after she disappeared. The investigators who watched it the first time did not speak for a long while afterward. They sat in a windowless room at Fort Carson, and they rewound the footage and watched it again. Then a third time. Not because they did not understand what they were seeing, but because the human mind resists certain truths, and this was one of them. The footage shows 44 seconds. It begins with darkness and wind, an open helicopter door, the Rocky Mountains spread below like broken glass under a half moon, the peaks white with late-season snow, the valleys black and absolute. The camera shakes once hard, as if the person wearing it has been struck from behind. Then the door fills the frame completely. Then there is nothing but ski and the sound of rotor wash, and the ground 8,000 feet below, rushing upward at 120 miles per hour. 44 seconds. That is what Staff Sergeant Mara Holt had on the night of April 14th above the Wet Mountain Valley in southern Colorado. That is also what her father spent 15 years teaching her to use. This is the story of those 44 seconds and everything that came after, 14 hours earlier. Fort Carson sits at the eastern edge of the Front Range where the Rockies finally exhaust themselves against the high plains. In April, the wind comes down from the pass is cold and steady, carrying the smell of pine and snowmelt. The mountains to the west look close enough to touch in the early morning. They are not. Distance is deceptive in that country. Men who do not know the Rockies have learned that lesson the hard way, and some of them did not survive the education. Mara Holt knew the Rockies the way most people know their own hands. She had been coming to this country since she was 7 years old, riding in the passenger seat of her father's truck, listening to him name every peak, every pass, every creek drainage by its proper designation. Not because he was teaching her exactly. That was not how Garrett Holt operated. He simply talked about the mountains the way some fathers talk about baseball, as though they were living things with history and personality and moods, and a person who paid attention would understand them in time. She had paid attention. By the time she was 12, she could navigate the Sangre de Cristo range at night without a compass, moving by terrain association alone, reading ridge lines and drainage patterns the way other children read street signs. By 15, she could estimate wind speed by the behavior of snow crystals in the air. By 18, she had put rifle rounds on targets at ranges that her father's old range cards listed simply as extreme. None of this appeared in her official service record in any useful way. What the service record showed was a 26-year-old staff sergeant with the 75th Ranger Regiment attached to a joint task force operating out of Fort Carson under the designation Task Force Ridgeback. The mission profile was counter-narcotics, specifically the interdiction of weapons trafficking networks moving hardware through the Rocky Mountain corridor from southern Colorado into the northern states. The record showed her performance evaluations as excellent. Her kill record was noted. Her years of service were noted. What the record did not show, because no document had been written that could contain it, was the thing Cal Whitmore had understood in the first week he worked beside her, that Mara Holt was operating at roughly half capacity and doing it deliberately, and had been doing it since the day she arrived. Whitmore was sitting at a folding table outside the operations building. When she came out that morning, a ceramic mug of black coffee balanced on one knee, his eyes on the mountains to the west. He was 30 years old, lean and quiet, with a stillness about him that people sometimes mistook for inattention. It was not inattention. It was the opposite of inattention. Whitmore noticed things and filed them away without comment, and over time the things he filed away composed a picture that most people never saw. He had been watching Mara for 11 months. She came out of the building carrying her rifle case and a half-eaten breakfast bar, and she sat down 2 feet from him without acknowledging him. This was not rudeness. This was simply how they communicated in the early morning before the day's noise began. They sat together for a while in the cold, and the wind and the mountains were orange-pink in the early sun, and nothing needed to be said. Then Whitmore said, "They put Kavanaugh in the brief." Mara chewed her breakfast bar and looked at the mountains. After a moment, she said, "When last night, late?" She processed this without visible reaction. Whitmore watched her the way he watched everything, which was quietly and from the side. Master Sergeant Grant Kavanaugh ran the Delta Force element that had been rotating through Fort Carson for the past 6 weeks in support of Task Force Ridgeback. He was 38 years old and built like something structural, like a load-bearing wall given a uniform and a bad history. His face carried the record of his career in scar tissue. 2 deployments to Iraq, 3 to Afghanistan, 1 to a location that appeared nowhere on any document that had been declassified. He had earned his skepticism the way men in his profession earned everything by surviving situations where the wrong assumption killed someone. His assumption about Mara Holt was professional and precisely stated and entirely wrong. He had read her file. He had read it carefully, which Whitmore had noticed at the time. Not the way a man reads a file to understand a colleague. The way a man reads a file looking for the seam, the place where the official narrative parts from the actual one. He had found what he was looking for, or thought he had. The numbers in Mara's record were unusual for a ranger of her rank and tenure. Unusual in the direction that suggested either an inflated evaluation process or a female officer being graded on a curve to satisfy a quota somewhere up the chain. Kavanaugh had made his conclusion and kept it professional. He did not say anything to her face. He simply operated on his conclusion the way competent men operate on working assumptions, quietly, consistently, and until the evidence changed. The evidence had not changed yet, because Mara had not given it reason to. The briefing was at 0900 in the main operations room, which was a converted classroom with a drop ceiling and fluorescent lights and a large flat screen mounted on one wall. Colonel Wade Decker ran it himself, which was unusual. Decker was 52 with the kind of authority that came from 25 years of institutional success. He was precise in his language and controlled in his manner, and Mara had never had a reason to distrust him. He had been her commanding officer for 14 months. He had commended her work twice. General Morrison, who commanded the Joint Task Force from Peterson Space Force Base 40 miles north, had signed off on the operation at 0630. His signature appeared on the operational order in the way signatures appeared when the authority above Decker had been properly consulted and properly recorded. Decker was precise about things like that. She sat near the back. Kavanaugh and his three operators sat along the right wall. Cal Whitmore sat 2 seats from Mara, close enough to pass information without being conspicuous about it. Operation Iron Canyon, Decker said. Conrad Voss. He put the name on the screen with a photograph. Voss was 47, broad-shouldered, with a businessman's careful grooming that could not quite conceal the harder thing underneath. He had started as logistics. Military hardware post-Soviet surplus moving through legitimate channels with fraudulent documentation. Over time, the channels had become less legitimate and the documentation had stopped mattering. By the time Task Force Ridgeback had reconstructed his network, Voss was moving weapons through the Rocky Mountain corridor in quantities that required serious infrastructure and serious protection. 3 interdictions in the past 8 months had cost him that infrastructure. 2 of those interdictions had Mara Holt's name on the operations report. Voss was moving tonight through the wet mountain valley. ISR had tracked the convoy for 6 days. The window to intercept was narrow. Delta takes primary on the ground, Decker said. Rangers provide air support and overwatch. Holt, you're in the bird for terrain guidance only. No ground operations. Kavanaugh did not say anything. He did not need to. The arrangement suited his operational assessment precisely. Mara said, "Copy that, sir." And that was all she said. Whitmore, 2 seats away, noted the stillness with which she accepted the assignment. Not resignation, something more disciplined than resignation. He filed it away. The thing about Fort Carson in April is that the base sits at 6,000 feet elevation and the peaks directly to the west reach 14,000. The vertical relief is enormous. Weather moves differently in that kind of terrain. Wind behaves in ways that do not match any model designed for flat ground. Mara's father had spent years teaching her how weather moved through mountain terrain because weather in the mountains was not metaphorical. It was a tactical factor. It affected ballistics, navigation, communications, rotary wing operations. It affected survival. C.W.O. Garrett. Garrett Holt had understood survival the way mechanics understand engines, not as a theoretical matter, but as a practical one with specific components that either functioned or did not. He had been assigned to Fort Carson for 9 years, long enough to know the wet mountain valley in every season and every condition. He knew the ranchers who ran cattle on the valley floor and the old Forest Service roads that did not appear on current maps and the places where a person could cache supplies and find them 3 months later undisturbed. He had passed all of this to his daughter with the same casual thoroughness that he passed everything, not as instruction, but as conversation. As the natural sharing of things that mattered. He died on September 3, 2015. The official report said training accident. It said he had been conducting a solo land navigation exercise in the Sangre de Cristo range and suffered a fatal fall on a technical section of terrain. The report noted that he was experienced and that the terrain was challenging and that accidents of this nature were a known risk. The report was signed by Colonel Wade Decker, who was then a lieutenant colonel newly assigned to Fort Carson 14 days into his command. Mara had read the report 8 times in the year after her father's death. She had read it the way people read things they already know are wrong, looking for the specific word or omission that will confirm the wrongness. She had not found it. The report was clean. The report was thorough. The report was the product of someone who understood exactly what a report needed to contain to withstand scrutiny. She had eventually put it away. She had not stopped thinking about it. The promise she had made at his gravesite at the Fort Logan National Cemetery in Denver was not stated aloud. It was not the kind of promise that needed to be stated aloud. She had stood in the November cold with her mother beside her, and she had made 2 commitments with the absolute private certainty that sometimes replaces speech. The first, she would come home. Her mother was 54 and lived alone in a house in Billings, Montana, and had already lost one member of her family to this profession. Mara would not make her bury another. The second was more complicated. Her father had given her the skills to be lethal. He had given her the understanding of terrain and ballistics and human vulnerability that constitutes at the core the knowledge of how to end lives efficiently and precisely. She had accepted that inheritance, and she had made it her own. But she would not use those hands as weapons against another human being in any form for any reason short of the last possible reason. When no other choice remained, when the cost of keeping the promise was worse than the cost of breaking it. She had not broken that promise. Not yet. She was in the armory loading magazines at 1640 when she decided to check the access log. It was not intuition exactly. It was closer to housekeeping. She had 3 caches in the field positioned across the Wet Mountain Valley and the adjacent terrain to the south and west. Standard procedure for a ranger operating in a defined area of operations: pre-positioned supplies, medical equipment, communication gear, escape routes. Each cache had a GPS coordinate stored in the Task Force Ridgeback system under Level 4 clearance. That clearance required authorization that very few people in the building possessed. She pulled the access log because she had not checked it in 2 weeks, and checking it was part of her routine. And routine in this profession was what kept a person alive. She found the entry at 1641, 72 hours earlier, 3 days before the mission had been formally approved and briefed. Someone with Level 4 clearance had accessed all 3 cache coordinates, not in sequence that might suggest a system audit, in a specific order, primary to secondary to tertiary, which was the order you accessed them, if you wanted to know how to destroy the resupply network of a specific operator before that operator needed to use it. The timestamp said Tuesday, 1423. Mara sat with that information for a moment. The armory was cold and smelled of solvent, and the lights hummed overhead. She went through the personnel list in her head the way she had been trained to go through a threat assessment systematically, without prejudice, eliminating possibilities. 3 people had Level 4 clearance on Task Force Ridgeback. The first was herself. The second was Cal Whitmore. On Tuesday at 1423, she and Whitmore had been in a vehicle together conducting a route survey 30 miles from the base. She had not been out of his sight for more than 4 consecutive minutes during the entire day. The third was Colonel Wade Decker. She loaded 2 additional magazines beyond her standard combat load. Then she loaded 2 more. If she was only observing from the aircraft, she did not need this ammunition. She loaded it anyway. Her father had told her once that preparation was the only form of prayer that actually worked. She had agreed then, and she agreed now. She did not tell Whitmore what she had found, not because she did not trust him, because she did not yet understand what she had found well enough to explain it, and because there was a mission in 4 hours, and the thing to do before a mission was focus on the mission. But she looked at him when she came out of the armor, and he was sitting on that same folding table with his coffee, and he looked back at her with the specific quality of attention he brought to things that were not quite right. She gave him nothing. Not yet. She went to prepare. The Black Hawk lifted off at 2300. The rotors beat the cold air into submission, and the lights of Fort Carson dropped away below, and the mountains came up dark and massive on all sides. Mara positioned herself near the door gunner, ostensibly for terrain observation. The real reason was that the door gave her the best available fields of fire in 4 directions, and the fastest exit if the geometry of the situation required it. She had not told herself why she was thinking about exits. Kavanaugh sat across the fuselage with his 3 operators, Hayes Mercer and Sergeant Owen Halsey, who had a stillness about him that Mara recognized as the specific patience of a man who had not entirely made peace with the orders he was following. She filed that observation away without acting on it. They were armed and helmeted, and their night vision made them look like something that had not existed before this century, which in a way was accurate. She had operated alongside Delta before. She respected the capability and reserved judgment on the individuals until the individuals had shown her something. Kavanaugh had not shown her anything yet, except his doubt. 20 minutes into the flight, the wet mountain valley opened below them, a broad trough between the Sangre de Cristos and the wet mountains, the valley floor dark and the peaks white, and the San Isabel National Forest, a black mass across the western slopes. She knew this terrain with a specificity that no briefing document had captured and no map adequately represented. She knew which creek drainages ran with snowmelt in April and which were dry. She knew the elevation of the valley floor at the southern end, which was different from the northern end in ways that affected weather behavior. She knew the cache locations or had known them before someone with level 4 clearance had visited them 3 days ago in a sequence that served no administrative purpose. The intercom crackled. Approaching phase Alpha. 3 minutes to target. Kavanaugh stood up. The movement was controlled and casual in the way that a man in his profession could make lethal preparation look like restlessness. Mara's right hand drifted toward her sidearm without conscious instruction. She had been trained by 15 years of accumulated observation to recognize the moment before violence. There was a quality to it that was distinct from all other moments, a slight tightening of the air, a shift in the arrangement of bodies relative to each other that the old parts of the brain read correctly, even when the conscious mind was still processing. She read it correctly. She had been reading it for the last 10 minutes, in fact, which was why she had taken the position she had and why she had loaded the extra magazines. In the green wash of the night vision, she saw Kavanaugh signal his team. Small gestures, practically invisible to anyone not trained to read them. But she had been trained, and she read them, and she understood them, and she felt the cold thing in her stomach that she had felt once before in her life at the age of 18, when she had stood in the snow above the valley where she had grown up and understood for the first time that some threats could not be reasoned with. Kavanaugh's voice came through her headset, conversational, as though they were discussing the terrain below. "You know what your problem is, Holt?" She turned, slightly maintaining peripheral vision on the other operators. She said nothing. He said, "You're too effective. The northern corridor has been shut down 3 times in 8 months. Command has noticed. The people who need those routes open have noticed." He paused. Conrad Voss is not just a weapons trafficker. He's a facilitator. Infrastructure. He has relationships with people who make decisions about what gets investigated and what gets filed away. He moved closer. And those people have decided that you are a problem that needs to be resolved. The pieces did not fall into place slowly. They fell into place with the sudden completeness of a structure, underload all at once, irreversibly. She said, "How much?" He said, "That's not really the relevant question at this point." She said, "Then what has he said?" "The relevant question is whether you make this difficult." The knife cleared its sheath with a sound that was almost gentle. The blade was matte black, the kind of finish that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. He held it the way men in his profession held knives, which was at the end of a fully extended arm, the tip describing a small flat circle. She had run the calculations while he was talking. 5 operators confined fuselage 8,000 feet of altitude. The math was not favorable in the conventional sense. But she was not looking at this problem conventionally. She was looking at it the way her father had taught her to look at every problem. What do you have? What do you know? What does the terrain offer? The knife moved faster than she could respond to. It caught the harness straps at the junction point and cut them with 2 strokes. She felt the release of tension across her chest and back. Before she had processed the fact of it, Hayes and Mercer had her arms. The door was open beside her. The Rocky Mountains were 8,000 feet below the valley floor, a silver thread of snowmelt, runoff, and shadow. "This is not personal," Kavanaugh said. Then she was falling. The first thing she did was stop screaming. She had not started screaming, but the impulse was there, a primal signal from the part of the brain that had not yet received the message that screaming was non-functional information. She dismissed it the way she would dismiss any non-functional input. The second thing she did was stabilize. Arms out, legs spread, the classic arch position. She had jumped from aircraft before with parachutes in training, and the body remembered the correct shape even in the absence of equipment. She was falling at roughly terminal velocity, which in the cold, thin air at 8,000 feet of initial altitude came to approximately 110 miles per hour. The ground was rising. The night vision was still on her face, the world green and black and precise. 44 seconds. Give or take 2 seconds for the initial acceleration phase, which she had already consumed. Call it 40 seconds. She used 6 of them to orient. The wet mountain valley below her, she recognized immediately, not from the briefing materials, but from 15 years of her father pointing out its shape from various elevations during various seasons. The valley ran north to south. She was over the northern section. The valley floor was wide here, wider than it looked from maps. There was a creek drainage at the eastern edge, where snowmelt was running high. The creek was not what she was looking for. She was looking for the reservoir. The Taylor Reservoir sat at the southern end of a short drainage 2 miles southeast of her current position over the ground. In April, it would be full of snowmelt, which meant it would be deep, which mattered enormously, and the surface would have enough agitation from inflow to create the energy absorption she needed, which also mattered enormously. She shifted her body angle and began to track south and east. 28 seconds. The physics were not complicated. They were precise. Her father had spent a Saturday afternoon when she was 16 explaining the mathematics of high-altitude water entry using a legal pad and a diagram he drew freehand. The entry angle had to be within a 15-degree range of vertical, or the surface tension would be effectively solid at this velocity. Her feet had to be together, toes pointed, muscles engaged but not rigid. The entry had to be clean. Clean entry meant the water could bleed off her velocity over a column of depth, rather than stopping it instantaneously at the surface. An instantaneous stop from 110 miles per hour onto a surface that felt like concrete would produce results that did not permit further activity. A clean entry at the correct angle into sufficient depth could be survived. 15 seconds. She pulled her rifle tight against her chest. She locked her ankles. She positioned her hands against the sides of her helmet, protecting the neck junction. She felt the wind change as she dropped below the ridge elevation and entered the thermal layer above the valley floor, and she adjusted her angle fractionally to compensate. The reservoir came up in the night vision from a glittering abstraction to a specific feature to a rushing certainty. 10 seconds. She took the deepest breath she had taken in her life. She rotated from nearly horizontal to approximately 70 degrees from horizontal feet, leading angled slightly forward. 5 seconds. Her father's voice from a Saturday afternoon a decade past, patient and specific. It is not about being hard. It is about being correct. The water does not care about courage. It responds to geometry. 2 seconds. The surface of the reservoir filled her vision. She could see individual wave patterns from the inflow current. She could see the dark mass of submerged rock along the northern edge, and she was not angled toward it. She was angled toward open water. 1 second. Then the reservoir hit her like a decision that could not be unmade. The water did not feel like water. At 110 miles per hour, the surface of the reservoir had the quality of something structural, something that had opinions about being entered. The shock traveled up through her feet and into her legs and spine in a single compressed instant. That was not pain exactly, not yet, but was the raw material of pain before the nervous system had finished processing it. Then she was inside the water, and the world went from wind and velocity and rushing darkness to a cold so absolute it registered as heat. She was still moving, downward, fast. The entry had been clean. She knew this because she was conscious, because her vision had gone white, and then black, and then white again, rather than simply stopping, because the deceleration was distributed across her entire body rather than concentrated at any single point. Clean entry meant the water was doing its job, converting her velocity into depth rather than damage. She felt herself slow. She felt the column of water above her lengthen as she descended. Then she hit the bottom. Not catastrophically, but hard enough. Her feet cratered into silt and her knees buckled, and she went forward and her left shoulder struck something solid at an angle that produced a sensation she recognized immediately and without ambiguity. The joint came apart. The shoulder separated with a pop she felt rather than heard, and the arm went briefly electric, and then strange, and then useless. She was on the bottom of the Taylor Reservoir in April, in the Rocky Mountains of southern Colorado, with one functional arm and lungs that had been compressed by impact and were now expressing strong opinions about the situation. She pushed off the bottom with both legs. The left shoulder screamed the whole way up. She managed it the way she managed everything that was not immediately lethal, she noted. It filed it and continued. Her head broke the surface at what she estimated was 30 meters downstream from the entry point. The current from the snowmelt inflow had taken her. She gasped. The air tasted like high altitude and pine resin, and survival, which was the best combination she had encountered in some time. The mountains were dark around her, the peaks white under the half moon, the valley floor black and silent except for the sound of water. She looked up. The Black Hawk was a receding sound to the north. They were not circling back. Not yet. They had jobs and most had timelines, and the calculation was that 8,000 feet without a parachute produced a certainty that did not require confirmation. They would come back in the morning when daylight made the valley floor readable. Until then, she had time. She used it. She got herself out of the water by crawling along the submerged rock shelf at the eastern edge of the reservoir until her hands found gravel, and then she was on land, face down, coughing water that tasted of minerals and cold. She allowed herself 30 seconds of this. Then she got to her knees. Standing took 3 attempts. The left shoulder was dislocated. The left arm hung at an angle that was anatomically specific in its wrongness. 2 of her ribs on the left side felt the way ribs felt when they had been stressed past their tolerance, which was a sharp localized complaint that worsened with breathing and would worsen further with anything strenuous. Her right knee had taken something during the impact, a tearing sensation that she did not want to investigate closely yet because the information it would give her was not information she could act on immediately. She needed shelter. She needed her gear assessed. She needed her shoulder back in the socket. She moved into the tree line on the eastern bank, each step a negotiation between what her body was offering and what the situation required. The trees were ponderosa pine and Douglas fir old growth on the lower slopes, and they provided canopy that would break up her thermal signature if Kavanaugh's team came back with imaging equipment. She found a cluster of granite boulders 30 meters in from the water's edge, a natural alcove that offered concealment on 3 sides and a view of the approach from the north. She sat down with her back against the rock, and she looked at her left arm for a moment. Her father had shown her how to relocate a dislocated shoulder on a Tuesday evening in October when she was 17 using a foam roller and a door frame in a demonstration that he managed to make seem entirely routine. He had explained the mechanics clearly. The joint needed to be guided back along its natural axis of movement. Force applied incorrectly would worsen the damage. Force applied correctly at the right angle with the arm in the right position would produce a sound that was unpleasant to hear, but represented success. She used her rifle sling as a makeshift anchor. She controlled her breathing. She brought her left arm across her body at the specific angle her father had described, and she applied force in the specific direction that anatomy required. The sound it made was wet and final. She bit down on the sling and did not make any noise of her own. For a moment after, she sat very still with her eyes closed and her jaw tight, and the echo of the sensation moving through her chest and neck. Then she opened her eyes. Then she began binding the ribs with the strip of nylon webbing from her vest, wrapping it tight enough to provide support without restricting the lung capacity she would need. Then she took inventory of what remained. The rifle had survived. The case was waterlogged, but the weapon itself had been protected. She field strip bound it in the dark by touch, the same sequences she had performed so many times that her hands knew it the way hands knew a combination they had dialed 1,000 times. She checked every component. She reassembled it. She loaded it. Her radio was destroyed. Water had found the housing through the impact fractures, and the circuitry was finished. She noted this and moved on. Her GPS beacon had survived sealed in its waterproof housing in the lower left pocket of her vest. She did not activate it. Activating it would broadcast her position to every receiver in the Task Force Ridgeback system, which included the Operations Center at Fort Carson, which Decker controlled, which meant it would also include Kavanaugh and his team within 4 minutes of activation. She had her emergency kit waterproofed as a matter of habit, which had survived intact. Fire starter emergency blanket, basic medical supplies. She used the blanket for heat retention and did not build a fire. Smoke was visible for miles in mountain air, and she did not have miles to spare. The morphine injector was there. She looked at it for a moment and put it back. Pain was information. Fog was a liability. She would accept the information. She sat in the dark, in the cold under the emergency blanket, with her repaired shoulder and her bound ribs and her uncertain knee, and she thought about the access log. 72 hours before the mission. Level 4 clearance. All 3 cache coordinates accessed in sequence. She thought about this until it became a fact rather than a suspicion. Then she thought about what the fact required her to do next. Dawn came into the wet mountain valley from the east with the deliberate thoroughness of something that had been doing this for a longer time and saw no reason to hurry. The peaks to the west caught the light first, the snow going from blue-gray to orange to white in a progression that Mara had watched from various elevations over the course of her life and had never stopped finding useful. The light told her the time. The light told her the temperature trend. The light told her which slopes would produce thermal activity within the next 2 hours that would affect long-range ballistics. The Black Hawk returned at 0530. She heard it before she saw it. The rotors were distinct in mountain air, carrying further than most people expected, and she had learned their sound the way she had learned everything about this country. She was already in a new position by the time it came over the northern ridgeline, 300 meters from where she had spent the night, lying prone on a shelf of rock that gave her a clear view of the valley floor below. The helicopter worked the reservoir first. It circled twice at low altitude, the door gunner visible even at distance, the aircraft moving with the purposeful geometry of a search rather than a patrol. Then it moved south along the eastern bank, following the course the current would have taken anything that entered the reservoir from the north. It was looking for a body. That was the logical assumption, and it was doing the logical thing. It did not find a body because the body had relocated itself 3 times during the night and was currently lying on a rock shelf, watching through cracked but functional field binoculars. After 20 minutes, the helicopter landed on a flat section of the valley floor, a quarter-mile south of the reservoir. 5 figures came out. She recognized Kavanaugh by his movement. There was a directness to it that was almost geometric lines rather than curves, a man who had spent decades moving toward problems rather than away from them. He spread his team in a search pattern without visible communication. They were professional and they were thorough, and they were operating on the assumption that what they were looking for was not going to move. This was their first miscalculation. She watched them for 40 minutes. She noted the terrain they covered and the terrain they did not. She noted which members of the team checked their flanks and which defaulted to forward focus under stress. She noted the position of their communications equipment. She noted where Kavanaugh stood relative to his team when he used his radio. Then she moved. The primary cache was 3 miles south and 1,000 feet above the valley floor, positioned in a cleft between 2 granite outcroppings on the western slope of a ridge that appeared as an unnamed feature on most maps. She had placed it there 18 days ago. She had told no one the specific location. She had recorded it in the Task Force Ridgeback system under Level 4 clearance because protocol required it, because omitting it would have raised questions she did not want raised. She covered the 3 miles in 4 hours, which was slower than she could have done it uninjured and faster than she had any right to expect, given the current inventory of damage. The knee held. Not well, but functionally, which was the relevant standard. The shoulder ached with a consistency that she eventually stopped cataloging because it was not changing and therefore not telling her anything new. The cache was in the cleft between the granite outcroppings, exactly where she had put it. Someone had been there first. She stood at the entrance to the cleft for a moment and looked at what remained. The waterproof container had been opened and resealed, but not with the same care she had used originally. The seal was slightly off axis, a detail most people would not notice. The contents had been removed and replaced with rocks to maintain the approximate weight, which told her the person who had done this was thorough enough to anticipate the possibility that she would check by feel before opening. She opened it. The medical supplies were gone. The satellite phone was gone. The spare batteries were gone. The secondary ammunition she had staged there was gone. What remained was the rocks and an empty space and the particular quality of cold that permeated places where something important used to be. She sat back on her heels in the cleft between the granite outcroppings, and she worked through the implications slowly because it deserved the deliberate attention. The cache had been accessed 72 hours before the mission existed on any official document. Kavanaugh had received his operational orders from Decker 36 hours before the mission briefing, which she estimated based on the timing of his arrival at the intelligence section the previous week. Kavanaugh could not have ordered this cache destroyed before receiving orders that justified the operation, because operators at his level did not take that kind of unilateral action without authorization. The authorization would have had to come first. Decker had authorized the destruction of this cache before the mission existed. Before the mission existed, before the operational order was written, before any official mechanism had been used to position Kavanaugh and his team in proximity to her, Decker had already sent someone to remove her ability to survive independently in this terrain. This was not an opportunistic decision. This was not a response to circumstances. This was a plan. She sat with that for a moment. The wind came down from the higher elevations carrying the smell of snow. A Clark's nutcracker called from somewhere above her in the pines, the sound carrying clearly in the cold air, entirely indifferent to the information she was processing. Then she stopped sitting with it and started thinking about what it required her to do. She did not run. The logic of running was understandable. She was injured, she was unsupported, she was in terrain with no functional communication and no resupply. The argument for moving toward safety, toward population, toward the institutional structures that were supposed to protect people in her situation was obvious. The argument against it was also obvious. Those institutional structures had a commanding officer named Wade Decker. The communications network that connected her to rescue was the same network he controlled. The helicopter that would respond to her emergency beacon was dispatched from the base where he set the agenda. Running towards safety in the current configuration of the problem was running toward the man who had designed this situation. She did not run. She began to move through the terrain the way her father had moved through it, which was with the unhurried deliberateness of something that belonged here. She began to think about the shape of the problem and what the terrain offered. What the terrain offered was considerable. She knew the wet mountain valley and the surrounding drainages in the way that a person knows a place they have been coming to since childhood, which is qualitatively different from knowing it through maps and reconnaissance reports. She knew which trails the valley's deer population used and which were too exposed for anything that did not want to be seen. She knew the old Forest Service roads that had been abandoned after a 1997 fire. She knew a section of trail on the northern slope of a secondary ridge where the path was bounded by a specific combination of standing dead timber and boulder field that created a natural channel. She moved to that section of trail. It took her 2 hours. She set the trap in 40 minutes using deadfall timber and the existing topography, and nothing that would look manufactured to anyone who came to inspect the aftermath. It was the kind of trap her father had shown her in the context of hunting, never in the context of warfare, though the principles were identical. A trigger mechanism, a counterweight, a swing arc calculated to intersect with the space a person's lower body would occupy while negotiating the narrowest point of the trail. Then she moved to a position 600 meters to the north and waited. It took Kavanaugh's team 4 hours to reach the trail. They were moving carefully, which she respected, and they were maintaining proper dispersion, which she also respected. What they were not doing was looking for the specific kind of threat she represented, because the specific kind of threat she represented was a person who had fallen 8,000 feet without a parachute and then spent 14 hours setting up an ambush rather than trying to escape. That category of threat required an adjustment of assumption that most people could not make quickly. The last man on the trail was Sergeant Owen Halsey. He hit the trigger at the narrowest point. The timber came out of the dark at the edge of his vision, and he moved right with good instinct, fast, the kind of reflexive response that kept operators alive in compressed time frames. He was fast enough to avoid the primary impact. He was not fast enough to avoid the consequence of moving right, which was a gap in the trail surface where the ground dropped 8 inches onto a tilted slab of granite. His left ankle did not survive the landing. She heard the sound from 600 meters. She watched through her binoculars as the team stopped and formed a perimeter and assessed the damage. Halsey was down. He was conscious, and he was not quiet about it, which told her the break was clean rather than compound, because men in his profession could tolerate compound with more restraint than they could tolerate the specific nerve irritation of a clean transverse fracture. They would have to carry him or leave him. Either option changed the geometry of the problem in her favor. She moved to a new position. The radio shot was at 823 meters. She knew the range precisely because she had ranged it from 3 different positions using the mil-dot reticle before Kavanaugh's team had come within 2 miles, and the 3 measurements had averaged to 823 with a standard deviation that did not affect her solution. The wind was 9 miles per hour from the northwest, consistent, which was a reasonable gift from a day that had offered very few. Her left shoulder was bound and limited, and she managed the recoil by adjusting her cheek weld and accepting that the follow-through would be compromised. 1 round. She was not going to get a second one without revealing her new position, and position was the resource she had least of. Kavanaugh was standing at the eastern edge of a clearing using his radio, which she had predicted he would do at approximately this time, because she had watched his communication pattern for the past 6 hours, and he was a creature of operational habit, the way all professionals were creatures of operational habit. The antenna of his satellite-capable radio unit extended above his left shoulder at a slight angle. She breathed in, she breathed out. She found the natural pause between heartbeats that her father had described as the only moment of true stillness available to a human being. She applied 6 pounds of pressure to a trigger that broke at 6 1/4. The antenna disintegrated. Kavanaugh dropped. All 4 of his remaining operators dropped. They went from standing to horizontal in a fraction of a second, which was the correct response, and she did not fault them for it. The clearing was empty of vertical human beings within 1 second of the shot. Then there was silence. The shot's echo came back from the western ridge and then faded, and the valley was quiet again. Kavanaugh's voice came from somewhere in the grass. He had found cover behind a granite boulder and he was shouting across the clearing rather than using the radio he no longer had. His voice carried well in the mountain air. She was already moving. He was saying her name. He was saying things about resolution and options and the kind of pragmatic appeals that men in his situation made when the leverage had shifted. She did not respond. Responding would have given him a direction. She was already 400 meters away by the time his voice faded, and she was moving south toward the secondary drainage toward the night she would require to reach what she needed. She moved like the valley's own shadow. She found the package under the third rock on the left side of the trail at the top of the eastern approach. She had been aware of the possibility of something like this since the moment she watched Halsey hit the ground in the clearing. Not because she had expected it, because she had filed away the quality of his movement in the seconds before the trap triggered, which had included a brief, almost imperceptible hesitation that was inconsistent with the behavior of a man who had fully committed to the mission he was on. The package was small, field-tape dark green standard issue. 4 batteries of the type used in her field recorder, which was a specific detail that required specific knowledge of her equipment. A folded piece of paper no larger than a matchbook. East Ridge. Do not use the radio. 4 words in a direction. No signature, but she did not need one. She had seen Halsey's handwriting on a route overlay 8 months ago, one of those incidental moments of observation that her brain had retained without instruction. She stood on the trail in the afternoon light, the mountains enormous around her, and she held this small piece of paper and understood its full weight. Owen Halsey had not volunteered for this. That was what the paper meant, stripped of everything else. A man who had genuinely signed on to kill her would not have left her a supply cache and a warning. He was here under a species of compulsion that she did not yet know the shape of, and he was doing what he could within the constraints of that compulsion, and what he could do was small and specific and real. He was also telling her something else. He was telling her that the radio was compromised, which she had already concluded. But more than that, he was telling her that someone above Kavanaugh was listening to that radio, that the danger was not only what she could see in the valley below. She put the paper in her vest pocket and moved. She reached the Delta Camp perimeter at 0248. She had been moving for 9 hours, including a 3-hour rest period between 1900 and 2200, during which she had allowed her body the minimum recovery time she could justify. The knee was worse than it had been. The ribs were a constant, low-frequency complaint that she had organized into background noise. The shoulder held, which was the important thing, because what she was about to do required 2 functional arms and the kind of absolute physical control that pain complicated. The camp was positioned on a flat section of the secondary ridge, defensible on 3 sides, with a clear line of sight to the valley below and the approach from the north. Professional placement. She would have chosen the same ground. 2 guards, Hayes on the north, Mercer on the south, sitting against a boulder with his knees up and his rifle across them, the body language of a man who had been awake for a long time and was managing it with discipline rather than comfort. She went in from the west, which they were not watching, because the western approach required coming across 40 meters of open ground with no cover. The open ground was the reason they were not watching it. The open ground was also from a slightly different angle of consideration, an unobstructed approach lane for someone willing to move at the speed of the ground itself. She covered 40 meters in 55 minutes. She moved the way her father had shown. Her deer moved in open country, which was in increments, measured not by distance, but by the attention cycles of observers. She moved when they turned their heads. She stopped when they faced her direction. She was on the ground with her cheek in the cold dirt for 11 of those 55 minutes, not moving at all, simply waiting, while Mercer worked through a stretch of alertness that would pass. It passed. She was inside the perimeter. Kavanaugh was asleep on a ground pad near the center of the camp, his right hand close to his sidearm, in the habitual way of men who had slept in the field for years. The satellite phone was clipped to his chest rig, charging from a small, portable battery pack. She could not take it. They would notice immediately. She could use it. She unclipped it with the slowness of someone diffusing something. It took 3 minutes to detach it from the charging connection without producing a sound that broke the register of the wind in the pines. She entered the recent calls. She entered the voice memos. She pressed play on the most recent recording and held it to her ear with the volume at its absolute minimum. Kavanaugh's voice speaking with the precision of a man who had been trained to be clear on communications even under stress. Package is still active, requesting immediate extraction support. Yes, sir. I understand the complications. No, sir. Cannot confirm elimination. Copy. Sanitize and extract. Then the other voice. She had heard Colonel Wade Decker's voice hundreds of times across 14 months. In briefings and hallways, in the practiced register of institutional authority. She had never had cause to distrust it. She had trusted it in the way that personnel who function within institutions trust the voices above them, which is to say provisionally, and because the alternative required evidence she had not possessed. She possessed it now. But it was not Decker's voice that stopped her. It was the file name visible on the phone screen when the recording ended, an attachment associated with the previous call. She opened it and found a financial document, 3 pages rendered small on the phone screen, but legible if she held it at the right distance and allowed her eyes to adjust. Column headings, entity names, transactions. Near the bottom of the second page in a column labeled Counterparty Entities, a name she had seen once before. Ridgeline Capital Partners, LLC. She had last seen that name on a Tuesday in November of 2015 when she was 20 years old and sitting in the office of the Fort Carson legal assistance officer who had helped her request her father's investigation file under the Privacy Act. The file had been partially redacted. The sections that remained showed a preliminary finding by CWO Garrett Holt regarding irregular financial flows connected to a series of property transactions in southern Colorado. The preliminary finding had been stamped unfounded and closed. The stamp was dated September 6, 2015. Garrett Holt had died on September 3rd. She was on her knees in a Delta Force camp at 3 in the morning in the Rocky Mountains, holding a satellite phone with a financial record on its screen, and she had stopped breathing without deciding to stop breathing. Her father had found this. Her father had written a report about this. Her father had been killed before the report could go anywhere, and the report had been stamped unfounded by the man who killed him, and she had spent 8 years believing the word accident because she did not have the specific name to put against the specific action. Ridgeline Capital Partners, LLC, Wade Decker. The cold that moved through her then was not the cold of the mountain night. It was the cold of a thing that had been sitting in the middle of her life for 8 years, unnamed and unresolved, suddenly acquiring its correct dimensions. She began to copy the document with the phone's screenshot function. She was on the 3rd screenshot when she heard the change in Kavanaugh's breathing. The sleeping body has its own rhythm, and she had learned to read deviations from it the same way she read deviations in wind patterns. His rhythm changed. His right hand moved. She had 1.5 seconds. Her father had not extracted from her a promise not to kill. That was not what she had promised. She had promised not to use these hands as weapons against another human being in any form for any reason, short of the last possible reason. She had carried that promise for 8 years, and it had never cost her anything because she had never been in a position where keeping it meant something worse than breaking it. She was in that position now. Keeping the promise meant Decker walked free. Keeping the promise meant her father's death remained stamped unfounded in a file that no one would ever reopen. Keeping the promise meant the last 8 years of his life had purchased nothing. She broke it. Her knife went through the back of his right hand and into the ground beneath it. He opened his mouth and she was already moving through the perimeter in the direction she had entered, already covering ground at a speed that the knee was not going to forgive. Behind her, the camp erupted voices, movement, the sound of a man in considerable pain, managing to give coherent orders anyway, which she noted with the remote professional respect it deserved. She was 30 meters out when the shot came. It was not aimed at her. It was a directed covering shot into the dark, from a man whose eyes had not adjusted, sent in approximately the right direction on the basis of sound. Approximately the right direction was close enough. The round caught her right hand at the base of the first 2 fingers. She did not stop moving. Stopping was not a functional option, and she did not consider it. She registered the impact and the heat, and the way the hand stopped responding to her instructions in a specific and permanent feeling way, and she continued moving into the dark, up the eastern ridge, into the terrain that belonged to her. Behind her, the voices faded. The moon was down and the stars were extraordinary, and the Sangre de Cristo mountains rose to the west, like the bones of something immense. She ran her thumb over the fingers of her right hand. Her father had first placed a rifle in those fingers when she was 8 years old, kneeling behind her on a cold morning, above this same valley, his hands over hers, patient and warm, adjusting her grip by fractions until it was correct. She could not feel 2 of those fingers. She ran her thumb over them again. Then she stopped because the information was not going to change, and she needed the hand she still had for what came next. She reached the eastern ridge at 0411. The climb had taken 1 hour and 40 minutes, which was longer than it should have taken, and shorter than she had any right to expect. The knee had made its position clear on the first switchback, and she had noted its position and continued climbing. The right hand was wrapped in the last of her field dressing, the material already dark pressure applied by instinct in the way that hands apply pressure to other hands when the mind is occupied elsewhere. She did not look at it directly. There was nothing to see that would improve the situation. At the top of the ridge, she stopped and turned east. The sky in that direction was the specific dark blue that preceded dawn by exactly 45 minutes in this latitude in this season. She knew this the way she knew most things about this country without having to think about it. Her father had shown her how to read pre-dawn light as a navigational tool. When she was 9 years old, standing on a ridge not unlike this one, his arm extended, his finger tracing the horizon. The valley below was quiet. She could see the Delta camp as a faint disturbance of light, a headlamp or two moving through the dark. They were not pursuing. Kavanaugh was managing a hand injury and a team that had been awake for 30 hours in an operational situation that had departed significantly from its original parameters. The pursuit would come with daylight and the organizational clarity that daylight provided. She had 45 minutes. She sat down with her back against a boulder and she looked at her right hand. The round had entered at the base of the index and middle fingers on the dorsal surface and exited through the palm. The damage was not to the fingers themselves, which she had initially feared, but to the structures beneath them, the tendons and the small bones of the metacarpal that govern fine motor control of precisely the two fingers that a right-handed shooter used to index a trigger. The fingers were present. The sensation in them was not. She moved them experimentally. The index finger produced a response that was approximately correct. The middle finger did not respond. She was a right-handed shooter. She had been a right-handed shooter since the age of 8. Without the middle finger's input, the grip was incorrect. Without a correct grip, the trigger control was incorrect. Without correct trigger control, the shot broke wrong. At the distances she had been trained to work, a shot that broke wrong was not a near miss. At those distances, there were no near misses. There was only precision or failure. She understood what this meant, and she put it away because the morning was coming and she had work to do before the morning arrived. She had the recorder, she rewound it and pressed play. Her own breathing. Wind, ambient sound from the camp perimeter. Then the quality of audio changed as she had held the recorder near the phone speaker, and Kavanaugh's voice came through, and then Decker's voice, and then the words that she needed to exist in a form that was not only her own memory. Package is still active. Cannot confirm elimination. Copy. Sanitize and extract. The voices were identifiable. The words were clear. She had worked with the legal assistance system long enough to know that imperfect was not inadmissible, and that the standard required for a federal investigation was lower than the standard required for a federal conviction, and that she only needed to survive long enough for the first process to begin the second. She thought about Whitmore the way she thought about reliable terrain, not with sentimentality, but with the practical confidence of someone who had tested it repeatedly and found it did not give way. He was the second name on the level 4 list. She had cleared him on the Tuesday alibi, and she had been right to clear him. But the more useful fact was simpler than the alibi. Cal Whitmore had been watching this situation develop for 11 months. He did not watch things develop without preparing for the conclusions they were moving toward. He would not have waited for her signal. He would have started the moment the helicopter lifted off. She stood up. She stood up fully on the flat granite shelf on the eastern face of the ridge, with the rising sun behind her, and the valley below, and the mountains enormous in every direction. She looked at the recorder in her hand. She looked at the wrapped right hand beside it. Then she loaded the flare gun. At 0537, she heard the rotors. Not one helicopter. The layered sound of multiple aircraft, the overlapping tonal signatures of at least 3 rotors, the specific complexity of a formation rather than a solo approach. She raised her binoculars. From the north moving south along the valley at altitude, she could resolve 3 aircraft. 2 Blackhawks in loose trail formation. An Apache Escort offset to the west flying at a higher altitude with its nose slightly depressed, which was the posture of an aircraft whose weapons systems operator was actively engaged with target identification. The Apache meant authorization. Apache assets required a release authority that sat above Decker's operational control. Someone with more weight than Decker had put this formation in the air. She watched the formation for 2 minutes. The lead Blackhawk was moving with the directional confidence of a helicopter that knew where it was going. It was not searching. It was navigating to a specific point, which meant someone had given it a specific point, which meant someone had information about her position that she had not transmitted. The GPS beacon was still inactive in her vest pocket. She had not used the radio. She had fired one rifle round 18 hours ago, and the echo had long since dispersed. She thought about Whitmore and the specific nature of what he would have done, and she thought about the server access logs and the financial records and the communication patterns over 6 months. And she thought about the FBI field office in Denver and what a person with level 4 clearance and a working knowledge of the task force Ridgeback system could reconstruct from available data if that person began working immediately and did not sleep. He had given them her last known operational area, the Eastern Ridge, which any terrain analyst looking at the mission profile and the valley geography would identify as the most defensible elevated position available to a ranger operator moving east from the reservoir. She raised the flare gun. She did not fire it yet. The lead Blackhawk was close enough now that she could resolve individual faces in the cabin. She tracked it with the binoculars, moving her focus from the aircraft to the door to the figures visible in the open cabin. The door gunner was in position. Behind him, she could resolve 3 figures. 2 of them were wearing civilian tactical gear. Not military, not task force Ridgeback issue. She could see what they were wearing on their jackets, dark blue with yellow lettering that the distance partially obscured but did not conceal entirely. The 3rd figure was Colonel Wade Decker. He was standing at the forward edge of the cabin door in the specific posture of a man who had come to oversee something personally. Not in the rear, not in a supervisory position, but at the door looking down at the terrain below. Looking for her. She lowered the binoculars slowly. This was not a rescue formation. The FBI agents were not there to protect her. They were there because Decker had brought them, because a man in his position controlling the operational picture could shape the narrative of what those agents saw and what they were told had happened. He had done it before. He had done it on September 6, 2015, when he stamped a report unfounded 3 days after the man who wrote it died. He intended to do it again. She looked at the flare gun in her hand. Her father had calculated in situations like this his entire career. Not with panic, not with resignation, but with the patient arithmetic of a man who understood that every situation had a solution if you identified your assets correctly and matched them to the problem in front of you. She stood up fully on the flat granite shelf and she made herself visible. She raised the flare gun directly overhead and she fired. The round went up like a red star hanging in the cold mountain air above the ridge visible for miles in the clear April morning. Here, this position, this person. Come and see. The lead Blackhawk altered course, immediately banking toward her, the door gunner's weapon trained on the ridgeline. She could see it. She did not move from where she was standing because moving would look like flight, and flight would look like guilt, and she had nothing to hide on this ridge in this morning. 50 seconds. The Apache tightened its orbit. The second Blackhawk began to descend from the south, approaching at a different angle than the first, its trajectory not converging with Decker's aircraft, but positioning itself between that aircraft and the ridgeline. 30 seconds. The lead helicopter was close enough now that she could see Decker's expression without the binoculars. It was the expression of a man calculating whether the variables had changed enough to require a change in approach. She watched him look at the second Blackhawk. She watched him understand what the second Blackhawk's position meant. She watched the calculation happen in real time on the face of a man who had spent 25 years being very good at calculations, encountering the one he could not resolve. 20 seconds. The second Blackhawk touched down 30 meters to her south. Cal Whitmore came out first. He was moving at the pace of a man covering ground without giving the appearance of urgency, and he had his field jacket on and no helmet, and the same expression she had seen on his face the first week they worked together. The expression of a man who had been watching something develop for a long time and had arrived at the moment he was watching it develop toward. He stopped 4 feet from her and looked at her, at the hand, at the shoulder, at the rib she was carrying, with the controlled stillness of someone who had learned to breathe around pain. His face did not change. He took in the inventory without commenting on it, which was the correct response, and then he looked at her face. She held up the recorder. He nodded once. Then he reached into his jacket and produced a tablet, and he turned it so she could see the screen. Financial records, communication logs, access histories. The Ridgeline Capital Partners, LLC documentation laid out in a structure considerably more complete than the 3 screenshots she had managed on Kavanaugh's phone. Server data transaction records, a pattern of activity stretching back 6 years and including on the 4th page a series of entries dated September 2015 in a column that corresponded to timeline. He had not waited. He had started the moment the helicopter lifted off with her in it, and something in the arrangement of the situation told him that waiting was the wrong choice. He had worked through the night, and he had built a case that did not depend on her testimony, that did not depend on the recorder in her pocket that stood on its own documentation and would stand in a federal courtroom without her in it. He had sent it to the FBI field office in Denver at 03:12. He had sent it to the office of the senior senator from Colorado at 03:17. He had not sent it to anyone in the military chain of command, because he understood without being told that the military chain of command currently ran through Wade Decker. Behind her, she heard the FBI agents reach the door of the lead helicopter. She heard Decker's voice, controlled and precise in the way it was always controlled and precise, offering an explanation referencing his authority, constructing the institutional argument he had spent a career learning to construct. She did not turn around. She was looking at the tablet, and she was listening to the voice, and she was thinking about a report stamped unfounded on September 6, 2015, 3 days after the man who wrote it died on a mountain 3 miles from where she was standing. She heard the specific sound of restraint being applied. She turned around then. Decker was on his knees on the granite. His hands were behind him. The two FBI agents were efficient and quiet, and they had the practiced neutrality of people who had done this before and understood that the moment did not require commentary. One of them was reading from a small card. The words were standard, and she had heard them before in other contexts. Decker was looking at her. She looked back at him. She held his gaze for the time it took to confirm what she already knew, which was that there was nothing in his expression that resembled remorse, only the cold recalculation of a man assessing the new configuration of his situation. She looked at him until she had seen everything there was to see. Then she looked away because she was finished with him, and there were other things that required her attention now. Grant Kavanaugh gave his statement 4 days later in a room at Fort Carson with two FBI agents, a AG officer, a representative from the Senate Armed Services Committee, and a military stenographer who typed with the mechanical consistency of someone who had long since stopped being surprised by what passed through the room. He spoke for 3 hours and 40 minutes without interruption. He described the structure of the arrangement between Decker and Conrad Voss, which had begun 6 years earlier as an information-sharing arrangement and had evolved into something considerably more substantial. He described the specific mechanism by which Decker had acquired leverage over him, which was the documentation of his son's addiction, a fact he had concealed from his command, and the specific threat Decker had made, which was clear and was made once and never needed to be repeated. He described the operational plan for April 14th, including the cache destruction, including the intended outcome, including the communication afterward. He described the arrangement the way a man describes something he has been carrying for a long time and has finally set down. Not with relief exactly, with the specific exhaustion of a person who has stopped spending energy on maintenance. When he finished, he asked about Owen Halsey. The JAG officer told him that Halsey was cooperating fully, that the circumstances of his involvement had been reviewed, and that the recommendation was immunity in exchange for continued cooperation. Kavanaugh nodded once. He did not say anything further about Halsey. He asked about one other thing. He asked whether the investigation into the September 2015 death of C.W.O. Garrett Holt had been reopened. The JAG officer told him it had been reopened the morning after Decker's arrest. Kavanaugh nodded again. He looked at the table for a moment. Then he said that he had not been involved in 2015. He said it with the flat insistence of a man who needed the record to contain one thing that was true without qualification. The room noted it and moved on. He provided 11 hours of additional testimony over the following 3 days, including the current location of Conrad Voss, who was apprehended by FBI agents at a property outside Pueblo, Colorado, 48 hours later. The weapons network Voss had spent 6 years constructing was dismantled over the subsequent 4 months. None of this appeared in any public report. It appeared in the files of the unit that would eventually occupy Building 7 at Fort Carson, cataloged under the operational series that had begun with a helicopter door opening over the Wet Mountain Valley on the night of April 14th. What the room did not note, because rooms do not note such things, was that Kavanaugh was 38 years old and that he had been a soldier since he was 18, and that the sum of what he had built across those 20 years had been constructed on the premise that the institution was worth serving. He was not a man who had discovered that the institution was imperfect. He was a man who had discovered that he had allowed the imperfection to use him, and the distance between those two discoveries was the distance between a career and a reckoning. He was handcuffed at the wrists when he left the room. He walked without assistance. The hand was evaluated at Evans Army Community Hospital by a surgeon who spoke in the precise neutral language of someone who had learned long ago that the medical facts were not improved by softening them. The tendon damage was repairable with a high probability of restored function in the index finger. The metacarpal fracture would heal. The nerve damage affecting the middle finger was not repairable with current technique. There was a reasonable probability of partial sensation returning over 12 to 18 months. Full proprioceptive function was unlikely. She asked him what that meant for fine motor precision tasks at extended range. He told her. She thanked him, and he left the room, and she sat in the hospital bed in the morning light that came through the east-facing window, and she looked at her right hand. She moved the index finger. It moved correctly. She moved the middle finger. It moved approximately. She thought about what approximately meant at 800 meters. She thought about what approximately meant at a different scale in a different context, and she understood that those were different questions with different answers. She spent a long time at that window. 2 weeks after the arrest on a Thursday morning in late April, Mara was walking the main corridor of the Fort Carson headquarters building on her way to a scheduled debrief with the Senate investigation staff. The corridor was long and institutional, fluorescent lit, with the particular character of a place that had been walked by many people for many decades without acquiring anything that could be called personality. General Aldrich was coming from the opposite direction. He was 61 years old and had commanded the installation for 14 months, and before that had commanded things in places that were not discussed in public. He walked with the economy of movement of someone who had spent decades conserving effort. He was not a man who communicated in speeches. His communications adjutant had once told a colleague that in 4 years of working for him, the adjutant had heard him use the phrase, "well done," exactly twice, and both times it had meant considerably more than the words. They were 10 feet apart when he saw her. He saw the hand first, the bandaging still visible below her sleeve. Then he looked at her face for exactly long enough to confirm what he had come to the corridor door, already knowing which was the shape of what had happened on the eastern ridge and what it had required and what it had cost. He stopped walking. He did not say anything. He looked at her right hand with the expression of a man reading a document he has already read, confirming the details are what he remembered them to be. Then he stepped to his left toward the wall, creating a clear path on his right side of the corridor. He was stepping aside, not symbolically, physically. He moved himself out of the center of the corridor, and he held that position, and he looked at the wall ahead of him rather than at her, the way a man looks when he is offering something and understands that looking directly at the moment would change its character. She walked past him. Behind her, she heard nothing. No comment, no acknowledgement, no ceremony. The corridor returned to its fluorescent silence. She continued walking, and she did not look back because looking back would have changed what the moment was. Cal Whitmore was at the far end of the corridor. He had come out of a doorway 30 seconds earlier and was leaning against the wall with his hands in his jacket pockets, ostensibly looking at his phone. He had seen everything. She could tell by the quality of his stillness, which was different from his habitual stillness, slightly more deliberate. He did not say anything when she reached him. He fell into step beside her. They walked toward the debrief in silence, which was how they communicated best, and the silence contained everything that needed to be said and nothing that did not. Fort Carson Building 7. The designation appeared on no current organizational chart. It appeared in no public-facing directory. The physical structure was a converted administrative building on the western edge of the installation, close enough to the mountains that on clear mornings the peaks were visible from the east-facing windows, and the shadow of the front range reached the building by mid-afternoon. The unit that occupied it had no official name. It had a mission: internal investigations, counterintelligence operations, the specific work of identifying and addressing the institutional failures that official channels were either unable or unwilling to address. It had been established in its current form following a Senate inquiry 2 years earlier. It was staffed by 8 people. It reported through a chain of command that did not include anyone who had been in the same chain of command as Wade Decker. It had a vacancy. General Morrison had offered her the position in a conversation that lasted 4 minutes. He had described the mission in 1 sentence. He had described what the role required in 2 sentences. He had not described what it would mean to be part of it, because he was not a man who described what things meant. He was a man who presented facts and allowed the people he was presenting them to draw their own conclusions. She had drawn hers. She sat at the desk on a Wednesday morning in May, 3 weeks after the arrest, and 11 days after the hospital evaluation, with the mountains visible through the east window and the shadow of the front range, still an hour from reaching the building. The desk was clean. The previous occupant had left nothing which suited her. She preferred to begin with empty surfaces. On the corner of the desk, she had placed one photograph: C.W.O. Garrett Holt, taken at Fort Carson in the summer of 2012, 3 years before he died. He was in his Class A uniform, standing at an angle to the camera, the way people stand when someone tells them to look natural, and they respond by standing at an angle to the camera. He looked like a man who was slightly impatient to be done with the photograph and return to whatever he was doing before it interrupted him. That was accurate. That was precisely the kind of man he was. She placed her right hand beside the photograph at its edge. The bandaging was reduced now, the outer layers removed the injury visible in its current form. The index finger functional, the middle finger present. She thought about a Saturday afternoon and a legal pad and a diagram drawn freehand. She thought about a report stamped unfounded on a date 3 days after the man who wrote it stopped being alive to contest the finding. The report had been unstamped now. The finding had been revised. The revision would not be public for some time pending the conclusion of the federal prosecution, but it existed in the record and it would remain there, and in some part of the institutional memory that outlasted individuals. The true account of what had happened on September 3, 2015 was no longer missing. It was not enough. She knew it was not enough. She had understood since she was 20 years old that there was no sufficient compensation for the thing that had been taken, that the word enough did not apply to losses of that particular kind, and that the best available outcome was not justice in the absolute sense, but the specific lesser thing that could actually be achieved. The record being accurate, the account being true. The record was now accurate. The account was now true. She looked at the photograph once more. Then she opened the first file on her desk. The case was dated 18 months prior. The subject was a logistics officer at a base in the Pacific Northwest. The preliminary indicators were financial. The file was 300 pages and she would read all of it before she formed a conclusion, because conclusions formed before the evidence was fully read were the specific failure mode that the people who had built this situation had relied upon. Outside the east window, the Rocky Mountains stood in the May morning light, the same mountains her father had named peak by peak on a truck road when she was 7 years old, and could not yet understand why he was teaching her to read them. She understood now. She read the first page. Then she read the second.